even just 4 weeks of healthy lifestyle change makes the influenza shot. Even if people don't lose a pound, they get the flu shot, or they do some lifestyle change before getting the flu shot, their post-flu vaccine antibody levels are significantly higher.
What are some of the things that you've really seen come to light that has made us as a culture so susceptible to this big issue that we're facing?
Yeah, well, first of all, again, thanks for having me here, Shawn. I was telling my mom earlier, just a small side story, that you and I think on the same, this is our first time meeting in person, but man, we think alike. And so it's great to connect with you on these topics, because a lot of people are so stuck into what they hear on TV. Everyone is equally susceptible. Everyone needs to stay home. The only path forward is, even this morning, I think new lockdowns are being talked about in early mid-April here. So, when this whole thing, just a quick backstory, when it first started, the first 20 fatalities were just down the road from my house at this nursing home in Kirkland, Washington. So I was really interested in okay, well, because I'd heard about Corona, December of 2019, we all were hearing about it, but the media wasn't really talking about it. And it was one of these things hey, if this comes over here and becomes a problem, I have a young daughter. I want to know how bad is this? My parents are in their 70s. Anyway, I started to dive into the literature, and even back then, data from Wuhan and Italy showed that the supermajority of hospitalizations and all that were in elderly people, or people that had chronic, non-communicable diseases like high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity. And I thought, that's interesting, because I'm not hearing about that on the media. And so, yeah, just, and here we are over a year later, and that consistently comes up. And so when you and I started talking about this, we were conspiracy theorists, we were science deniers, but the science has really elucidated some of this data. Just the other day, I think it was Tuesday of this week, British Medical Journal looked at 48,000 individuals in Southern California here from Kaiser, and found that people that exercise, they have people that don't exercise compared to people that do regularly exercise leading up in the 6-month window prior to the outbreak. So this was in 2019, have a 2.7 or 2.9 times less likelihood of dying from COVID-19. So that should be the message, right? I mean, how many more masks and how much more hand sanitizer can we put on? So to answer your question with that sort of backstory, it just, what we have, and you talk about this in your book and have talked about this a lot, is chronic low-grade inflammation. Just is sort of bandwidth our immune system, that renders our immune system less responsive to deal with acute insults. Whether that acute insult is a laceration or a trauma or a burn. Studies over the years have shown that overweight people, they don't recover from surgical procedures as well. If they need an orthopedic, hip replacement or knee replacement, if they get an infection, whether it's influenza or SARS-CoV-2, they just don't do as well because their immune system, we can dive into the nuances. I know you want to get there. The innate and adaptive immune system, so our sort of automatic, there's no memory in our innate immune system. It's just it sees pathogens, antigen, it goes. There's this communication. The innate immune system needs to tell your memory side of your immune system, the adaptive immunity, that there's a problem. There's the virus. You need to ramp up antibody production or T cell immunity. That communication becomes, just like if we have too many programs open on our computer starts to run sluggish. So if people are hitting up McDonald's, if they're going to Dunkin' Donuts in the morning, if they're chronically, have this smoldering low-grade inflammation, there's this aberration in their immune system's ability to mount an appropriate response. And I think ultimately that's part of the problem. And then you see this viral load and the endothelial dysfunction that you talked about with William Lee and other people is, the pre-existing cardiometabolic risk factors. A lot of people have thick, hypercoagulable blood. And so then you add on this insult, and it's just the straw that breaks the camel's back. So yeah, I mean, you and I have been sharing this message. People think it's controversial, but if we want to sustainably get out of this, because all of these solutions ultimately right now, for the most part, are unsustainable. We get booster shots, more vaccines. I'm not anti-vaccine, but it's we have 330 million people, right? To manufacture that many doses and then new doses under good quality control, that's a logistical hurdle. We have kids that are out of school, they're on Zoom, they're getting more overweight. They're learning bad habits. They're spending time on screens. These things have unintended harms. And so my message and your message has just been hey, look, just like we look at health and nutrition, let's look at the root cause of what's making people sick and what can we do to sustainably make them more resilient.
Yeah, I love that so much. And so one of the things that you just kind of paired together, there's even a dramatic decrease in effectiveness of even vaccines when we're in a state of obesity. Is that right?
I mean, studies have shown this way over the years. And now when you say that, though, people get triggered because they think you're anti-vax and you want their grandma to die. And that's not the case. We want people like, so I don't know if it's worth talking about, but for example, I did anabolic steroids in my 20s. Preparing for that, I was like eating real food, not drinking, not partying, because I wanted to get the most mild. Like if I'm going to stick something in my body, I want to get the most out of it. And what I see people doing is they're unaware of the fact that if you give a vaccine to two different people, one who lives a healthy life, one who lives an unhealthy life, the responsiveness is going to be so much better. And that person who lives a healthy life and exercises is going to get so much more immunologic protection from that, because we can talk about the different mechanisms by which these vaccines work, with whether it's micro mRNA or these adenovirus vectors or whatever. Ultimately, it's your own immune system that is creating that protection. You're not just getting a surrogate immune system. Your immune system needs to recognize, this mRNA or adenovirus and mount an adaptive immune response. And like if you have this chronic smoldering inflammation, like we were talking about from eating processed food, that's not going to occur. So people might feel that I'm so protected because I'm getting this shot, whereas they might have maybe 1 month of protection or insufficient antibody production in the post-vaccine window. So the reason why I brought up that story about the steroids is, a lot of people that we just need to realize, like, I wish more people would get behind the healthy living concept if they're also going to get the vaccine, because they're going to be most protected from that. So to your point, multiple studies over the years with tetanus shots, with hepatitis B vaccinations, with even seasonal influenza. Now, here's the cool part about it, because a lot of naysayers will say, well, we don't have time to get people so healthy. Even just 4 weeks of healthy lifestyle change makes the influenza shot independent of any weight loss. So even if people don't lose a pound, they get the flu shot, or they do some lifestyle change before getting the flu shot, their post-flu vaccine antibody levels are significantly higher. This was, I'm sure everyone has been to the hospital and seen overweight nurses and things like that. In the hospital setting, there are some unhealthy people just because of the stress and lifestyle and so forth. And so they want those people to be protected. And there was a cohort of, in this one study of like 60 women. They got the flu vaccine, scientists looked after, and they didn't have protection from an antibody standpoint. So they had them do some lifestyle change and then measured it, and it was significantly protective. So now that message is not, I've never heard anyone that's promoting vaccines say you should also not hit up the Krispy Kreme offer. Right. and that, I think, is the science is there.
It's negligent, really. It's negligent. It's just, again, but this is the thing that I think that we can easily miss, is that this is normal for this system of medicine, which is we're still trying to treat a symptom and not address the underlying cause. We're trying to treat a symptom and not actually do the thing that is most effective, which is, again, coupled with the advice to wear a mask. You can also say, make sure to get in your 30-minute walk today, or, coupled with all of the insane push to get vaccinated. I've never seen anything like this remotely close. Like, you can't even open up an app on your phone, and like these companies are just like, but the thing is, again, you just mentioned the effectiveness is so much lower. Like, we know this stuff, study after study after study. If you're not getting yourself healthier, it could be, hey, get this thing, but you also need to get yourself a little bit healthier as well. We can package the messages together at least, but this part is left out, the get healthy portion, because it's always been left out.
Right. You bring up a great point, and that's what this whole pandemic has sort of exposed, is the inadequacies and the unsustainability of how we sort of view medicine through the acute care model, and not looking at the unintended harm of our interventions, whether it's the treatments. If you look at ventilators, right, it was like 89% of people that went on a ventilator ended up dying, and the unintended harm with microbiome issues and hand sanitizer and stuff like that. So yeah, we need to. And this is something that Barack Obama, if you look at the Affordable Care Act and some of that, precision medicine was a facet of that. And looking at people's individual biochemistry and genetics. You and I have different genetics, women are different than men, and stratifying based upon risk, age, genetics. But now it's like this one size fits all. Everyone needs to wear a mask. Well, I've been exposed to SARS-CoV-2. I just retested my antibodies on Monday of this week. I still have higher levels than most people in the vaccination studies to the spike protein in terms of antibodies. and antibodies to this nucleocapsid, which is another structural element of the SARS-CoV-2. So it's like, why should I be wearing a face mask? Like, if you've been exposed, why would you need to wear a face mask? Or if you've been vaccinated. So the nuances get lost in, I think that's a shortcoming of our public health communication lately.
That's called science, and that's the thing too, is that, so again, you got the vid, you got some of that fresh Seattle strain of the vid,
right?
And can you share a little bit of your experience, and then also just to lean into that a little bit more, because there's something that you said earlier, and I don't want to move past this. You mentioned one of the studies with vaccine effectiveness in the hospital setting, and this is what we do. I'm actually going and just looking at the data and understanding it from the perspective of logic and science, and also working as a clinician for many years, and seeing this, the CDC's report, the biggest population of folks in any vocation hospitalized from SARS-CoV-2 is hospital workers, which is just like, well, of course they're on the front line. But what is missed in the study is 90% of them had at least one pre-existing chronic disease. Wow. About 75% of healthcare workers hospitalized were obese. Not overweight, obese. So there's this underlying susceptibility. It's clear, and it's not getting addressed. And so we see far worse symptoms. This is obvious. Far worse symptoms, whether you get an infection, and also far less effectiveness if we're talking about a vaccine, if you're not healthy as well. So again, the health component is still missing. So yeah, you got the Seattle vid, and this is what I love about your work, man, is that you share the data, you share the experience, but then you continue to reframe it and look at like what can be done here.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that was kind of the message going into it. And I wasn't trying to actually, get exposed to this, but I also didn't want to put my life on hold anymore. Like, I did the stay home, stay safe for 2 weeks and everything. And then I realized, like, okay, this was the initial goal going into this. And then I started to hang out with friends like everyone else, because, social connections are a facet of health. Like, if you strip that away, you exacerbate dementia and, mood changes and everything. So I went to a dinner party with some friends after Thanksgiving, and we don't know who gave it to us, but I was supposed to film with my video guy. This was on a Saturday night. Then I started to feel kind of weird on Wednesday. And so I just called him. I said, Sam, I think I'm coming down with something. Maybe we shouldn't film just to be safe, because I know that his significant other is really worried about coronavirus. Anyway, so I just thought I had a common cold. But to beat the common cold, I had tools. Like, we could talk about vitamin D. So I started to crank up my vitamin D, my vitamin A. I wore a face mask if I went in, my employees and everything like that. I said, hey, look, I have a cold. I doubt it's the big cold, but just let's do distancing and masking and everything like that. Went in my infrared sauna 3 times a day. And the next day, I was totally fine, right? So I thought, there's no way this is actually COVID. And then a week and a half later, I started to lose my sense of smell. And then my wife lost her sense of smell, and we were like, that's weird, And then I called my buddy who we had dinner with, and they're like, oh yeah, we lost our sense of smell too. So then I got my antibodies tested, and they had a lot of upper respiratory stuff. Some of them are older than me, but some of the folks we were with don't exercise. So this was an interesting thing, even just in a cohort of 6 people. The folks that don't exercise regularly, didn't have the sauna, and again, this is N of 6, right, had worse symptoms than I did, which was kind of interesting. But there's a lot to sort of unpack there. But one thing that I think is sort of fascinating that a lot of people don't talk about is this loss of sense of smell, and sort of an indicator of maybe mild cognitive impairment or pre-dementia, because there's some data showing that if you have Alzheimer's or memory loss, this olfactory bulb and nerve tends to atrophy faster. And so I thought that was kind of interesting, because some of the unhealthy people that I know that don't regularly exercise, they still haven't regained their loss of sense of smell, and months later, like 6 or 7 months. And so I started to wonder if maybe that was like a symptom that, hey, your brain might be inflamed. Like, you might be at higher risk later in life of developing mild cognitive impairment or dementia. But anyway, so there's cool technology. I think a lot of people should test their antibodies, and there's now a T cell memory. So it's hard when you go to LabCorp or Quest, you can get IgG to now the nucleocapsid and the spike protein. But there's this new T cell test. I'll give it to you so you can put it in the show notes, where we can see if we have memory from our T cells, which is great, because the antibody immunity tends to go away if you're not re-exposed, but the T cell immunity can last up to 18 years. At least studies from 2003 have figured out. So to me, I think that's exciting. But again, this immunologic memory may be contingent upon your health going into it. So that's why it's like we must double down now on this healthy living concept, especially if to get herd immunity from vaccines or prior exposure.
Yeah. Okay, so you heard the same things early on, which was, again, I saw the data immediately coming out of Italy. I was watching press conferences, which was dubbed. I don't speak that much, Italian, but ciao, everybody.
Yeah.
But I was just like, okay, we're in trouble here, especially if this lands in the U.S. in a big way because of the susceptibility. And they were looking at somewhere in the ballpark was 88% of folks hospitalized, actually, no, who lost their lives with COVID on the death certificate had one or more pre-existing chronic diseases. About 50% had two or more. And it's just like, here in the United States, we are the sickest nation in the world as far as obesity, heart disease, diabetes, the list goes on and on. And initially, of course, there was this, well, we can't get people, Shawn, you're right, but we can't get people healthier overnight. Some of my colleagues, right? And number one, of course, it's just like, first of all, that's not true. Second of all, we're doing that thing again where we are neglecting the most important thing. We're giving an excuse. And so I started to literally share data on, okay, this randomized controlled trial looking at just one night of sleep deprivation, for example, dramatically suppressing your immune function. Right. Here's 5 things that are clinically proven to improve your natural killer cell mobility, right? Production and mobility. Just these 5 things. Going for a walk, what I mentioned earlier, and that was Appalachian State University, just a 20-minute walk. It boosts your immune parameters, right? So there's all these things that can be done, and I was still like, okay, this is a tense battle here, but now we're over a year later, right, and the conversation still hasn't shifted. That whole can't get people healthy overnight thing, it's worn away. The only way that this is going to happen is if folks like you and I and everybody listening really take it upon ourselves to, number one, be the model, take care of ourselves, our families, but also encourage this, speak up, talk to other people, share the data. And so that's what I want to ask you about now is, and one more piece here, viral shedding. If we're looking at, when we're in a state of being overweight or obese, can you talk a little bit about that dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, all that stuff, I agree with you 100% on everything that you mentioned there. But there's no time for excuses. I mean, we've had time. And the sad part about that, before we get into viral shedding, is the people that were overweight or obese going into it, studies have now shown that they're more overweight and obese. So it disproportionately affected the very people that are most vulnerable, the very people who will get the least likely benefit from the vaccine. So that to me is kind of scary, but it goes to the other side because I know you wanted to talk about glycemic variability. So just real quick, there's now, and I'm sure you've worn one or know of them, the continuous glucose monitors. We now have data, people that wore those during lockdown and quarantine, their blood sugar control dramatically worsened. So not only have we created this unsustainable mitigation strategy that we cannot continue to do because we can't make people unemployed and all that forever, but we've made the people that were vulnerable more vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And so that's what worries me is seeing right now as we record this, Michigan, the Northeast are kind of blowing up, and they had 30% or more people have had at least one dose of the vaccine. So I'm starting to wonder if we are seeing sort of the real-time side effects of our interventions. And that's why we need to double down on this message and keep spreading this word. So everyone listening, share this message because it needs to be heard. But yeah, the idea that we're all super spreaders was kind of interesting to me, and that we're asymptomatic and carriers and everything like that was interesting. So I think it kind of goes back to this concept where we're talking about the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system. And so when we say cut our finger or get exposed to a virus, what should happen is our innate immune system should mount a response, and then slowly over time, the adaptive immune system should come in. But in people that are overweight or pre-diabetic, that communication is lost. So the virus tends to sort of replicate without any restrictions because there's dysfunction there, because of chronic inflammation and poor diet and glycemic variability. And so not only that, but this receptor that the virus utilizes to enter into our cells, people have heard about this, the ACE2 receptor, it's not only found sort of in the lung tissue and the cardiovascular system, it's found on fat cells or adipocytes. So the more body fat you have, the more sort of repositories you have to enable this intracellular, this virus to get into your tissues. And so, you have these overweight people who the viral load is a key problem. You and I are healthy. If you give us enough viral load, we can overwhelm our immune system and probably die. Whereas if we just caught this naturally, we'd probably be just fine. So viral load is an aspect that sort of facilitates the trajectory of disease. And so, the data shows, and more research, and this was actually from like April of last year, one of the first papers in the Journal of Circulation showed that obese people not only have a higher viral load, they carry more virus and they shed more virus too. So you're like, who are the people that should be masking all the time? And I don't want to pick on overweight people, right? Because there's a lot of external circumstances that cause that. Yeah. But it's like, if you're a lean person, had a mild course of illness, do you need to quarantine for 21 days or whatever? Like probably it should be a lot shorter because your viral load was less. So to me, that's even more of a message to double down, on this healthy living concept.
Yeah, man, that's so powerful. So you already mentioned a couple of states that have a pretty high rate of vaccinations, at least the first round of particular vaccine, and yet they're seeing cases rise, paradoxically. And the funny thing is about situations like that, health officials are very good at mansplaining or explaining themselves out of that and not actually being rational about it. One of the big things that is pretty obvious but overlooked is the fact that we're talking about more northern areas, for one. So if we're talking about the Northeast or even Michigan, for example. And this is so glaringly obvious. There's at least 15 studies looking at the connection between vitamin D deficiency and severe COVID infections. So let's talk a little bit about that. Like, how does that play into this? Because you mentioned vitamin D. That's one of the things you jumped right on. Yeah. Is that, I don't think it's a coincidence.
I don't either. Yeah, I'm with you 100%. If I were to put myself in their shoes, they just are not trained in that area, so they don't really know. And they might look at other states and say, well, Seattle, Washington is almost as north as Michigan. So, what's going on there? But clearly, the data with regards to vitamin D and its independent association with outcomes is non-debatable at this point. Multiple studies all throughout the world have shown this. And, this has been known, Shawn, and I know your listeners and you talk about this. This has been known in various other immune-related diseases from multiple sclerosis. There's a linear increase in disease severity as you go further north. Influenza outbreaks usually don't happen in the summer months because of, heat and vitamin D and all that. So the data is pretty unequivocal at this point. And people might wonder, well, how is it? Because when you hear about a vitamin, people think, those are at the health food store. It doesn't really matter. But if you actually look at the structural, features of vitamin D, it looks more like a steroid hormone. And we have this endogenous vitamin D receptor. So, there's not like if you take folate or folic acid, there's not like this. It does affect methylation, but what makes vitamin D unique is we have this own endogenous receptor that's found on a lot of various immune cells, your T lymphocytes, your macrophages, and so forth. And it's intimately involved with immunologic response, metabolism. There's data, the number one risk factor, depending upon the study you look at, is hypertension, high blood pressure. You have age, obesity, hypertension kind of fall right in there, then diabetes and all that. And we know that vitamin D affects this renin and angiotensin aldosterone system, the RAS system, that is regulating our blood pressure. So it's not just like one mechanism. I know you talk a lot about the microbiome and the importance of that. Several studies now have shown that when you take vitamin D, you improve diversity and stability of your microbiome. So this is one of these nutrients that obviously we should be getting from the sun. And the darker your skin is, you should be taking more. And this is where we stratify risk a little bit. It's not a one size fits all. Like the RDA says, 400 IUs per day. You're like, well, it depends on where you live and how much sun you get and everything. So, and what's interesting about this, it's way easier to make, 300 million doses of vitamin D than it is to make vaccinations that need to be refrigerated at like negative 70 degrees. You know what I mean? Like we could be doling this out. And it's not going to, there's the risk of harm or downside, there is virtually none. Right. You can overdo it and absorb too much calcium. There's been cases of that. But I started selling vitamin D in 2006. And I worked with a medical doctor, Gerard Guillory, who was big. He was an internal medicine guy. He started giving it to his patients and started to notice some really interesting changes. And just a small side story, we did this small study of about 40 firemen because he was the medical director for this fire department. We randomized people to get placebo or vitamin D, just 4,000 IUs, which is not much. And we had these subjective quality of life scores, going into it. And then it was 8 weeks after. Anyway, about 20 of these folks went on this cruise ship, and like a listeria outbreak happened, that can happen on cruises or hotels. And every single person in the placebo group, they got really sick and they couldn't enjoy the cruise. Every person, because it was like a group of firemen, right? They were hanging out and everything. Everyone in the vitamin D group, they all started talking. They're like, how come we're the only people that didn't get sick? Out of this, like, we're all rooming together, drinking, eating the same foods. And that, when we did that was in 2008. So it's always just, I like to share that story because this is not new. And we think because, this SARS-CoV-2, it's a new virus. So let's forget everything we know because it's somehow new. It's like, no, immunology and infectious disease principles still apply, even though maybe humans have not yet been exposed to this. So I think that's part of the problem with people is they can't realize that we still need to apply these principles. But yeah, I'm a huge fan of vitamin D, man.
Yeah, and you mentioned it too. It's the sunlight first. It's like that's how it evolved. And sunlight, funny enough, it's like the most powerful natural virucide, that exists. But, now Billy G's trying to black out the sun, block it out a little bit, which is, these things sound like a cartoon villain. Like, okay, we're gonna block out the sun. True story. We'll put a clip in here for you guys to see this. This is the new agenda, is to, basically, in a means to protect us from the sun, to dim its access to us.
Bill Gates is backing the first high-altitude experiment of one radical climate change solution, creating a massive chemical cloud that could cool the Earth. It's called solar geoengineering, and it's highly controversial. It would look something like this. Thousands of planes would fly very high and use nozzles to inject millions of tons of light-reflecting particles into the stratosphere. It would create a thin chemical cloud of those particles around the whole planet, blocking some sunlight from reaching the surface. It would mimic a giant volcanic eruption, which we know cools the Earth.
And then the immediate question is, what does that do to our ability to make vitamin D?
Or grow food or whatever.
Right.
Yeah. What are the harm? Like, dude, that's a major, you're throwing a cog into a interconnected wheel. Like, what's the unintended harm of that, man?
Right.
That is insane.
How does it affect, insects? And how does it affect the, whole ecological cycle? The list goes on. But these folks like gung ho, like, oh no, this will totally work, to reduce global warming.
Yeah, these scientists in Switzerland actually have been looking at the mitochondria, and I guess it's been long known since like 2010, which honestly I didn't know about any of this research. When you think about your mitochondria, we think about energy production, moving your muscles, running, all of the creation of cellular energy in the form of ATP. But it turns out that on the exterior cell membrane of your mitochondria, which are, if we think about, you've probably talked about this in your shows before, but organelles. If we think about our house, we have different little tools in our houses like furnaces and dishwashers and all of that. Well, think about all your cells. You have many appliances in there, and the organelles, the mitochondria, are one of those appliances that help create energy, because you can't directly oxidize. Well, fats and carbohydrates have to get split down and to make ATP. Anyway, so mitochondria have these antiviral peptides on their exterior cell membrane, and it's really involved in increasing levels of interferon, and interferon are really involved in the innate immune system. So that's part of the problem with severe disease is people don't mount a sufficient innate immune system response. The virus can increase its viral load and cause all this collateral damage. Well, turns out that this is a critical part of our innate immune system, and increasing all these downstream signaling pathways via interferon. So to me, I think it's fascinating because there's a lot of free things we can do to support mitochondrial health. Everything from compressing your feeding window, intermittent fasting, walking, weight training, like all of these things are available for most people, pretty accessible. Yeah, we don't hear about them, right? So a lot of people want to know, how do you test for your mitochondria? There's not really, to my knowledge, like a commercially available test. You might look at organic acids that can spill out different intermediates indicating mitochondrial dysfunction. But, if people have exercise insufficiency or the inability to properly exercise, you get really winded when you're taking out the trash or you're picking up your kid or whatever, that might be a subtle indicator that you have mitochondrial dysfunction. And And so if you go into this situation, we're going into winter, as we record this, there's influenza, there's SARS-CoV-2, there's different pathogens. If you have mitochondrial dysfunction, we can't really expect your body to mount a sufficient innate immune system response to take care of that pathogen before it starts to replicate. And it turns out that your mitochondria are also a target for these pathogens. Like they like to leverage the biomolecules within your mitochondria. And so that's the thing. So if you have dysfunctional mitochondria from eating omega-6 enriched diets, processed foods, you're metabolically inflexible because you eat a lot of sugar and refined carbohydrates that favor glucose oxidation, then maybe you're going to have a tougher time with a pathogen. So to me, I think it's just so exciting because, again, we have accessible tools that are free: walking, fasting, eating better foods, all of that are accessible. So this should be front page news, if you ask me.
I agree. And it's because of folks like you that are making this news. And it just makes sense. This is getting back to things that are very logical. Our mitochondria are really these generators of our energy. Our immune system requires energy. It's just a basic connective tissue right there. And so if we're having insufficient functions in that area, obviously we're going to be at a disadvantage. And so if we're looking at, and also I love this connection with the interferons, which is a critical aspect of being able to defend the body against viruses and the like. So, and I love the fact here that we can do something about this. And I love that you mentioned we don't necessarily have a test, but we do, which is paying attention to our bodies. We can probably notice if we're feeling winded easily, if we're venturing into being overweight, a little bit into obesity, or we're experiencing a chronic condition, having some autoimmune issues, that there might be something, very likely, some deficiency happening with our mitochondria, right? So this is, again, nudging us into actually getting our citizens healthier.
Totally. And it's interesting that you brought that up, and I thought of something that I forgot to mention. Our liver and our gut have a lot of mitochondria. Like, so your gut, your intestines are moving, and the motility and peristalsis, all the aspects of digestion and so forth. So a lot of people have gut dysfunction. So that could be another potential indicator. But the liver is really enriched in mitochondria. And so a simple blood test, and I recommend blood work, and we can dive into some of the nuances here. The category of blood tests, the liver function test, really common: AST, ALT, and GGT. So anytime you go to your doctor or healthcare practitioner, or you just go to directlabs.com or however you get your labs, you should run a comprehensive liver function panel. It's just these 3 tests, but when they start to increase, and these are just units, it's just international units per liter. So when they start to increase over 25 or 30, that is an indicator that your liver is accumulating fat. And that would be a suggestion that the mitochondria are unable to keep up with the demand of all the supply from insulin resistance. And so that could be a proxy as well. So fatty liver disease would be an indicator of mitochondrial dysfunction, specifically in the liver. So I encourage people to test for that, for sure.
Yeah, that makes sense as well. So you mentioned as well that one way to encourage healthy mitochondria function, production, is a little bit of intermittent fasting or restricting our feeding windows. We have those benefits with autophagy, obviously, but then there's another aspect, mitophagy. Can you talk a little bit about that too?
Yeah, I mean, autophagy is so fascinating to me, and I know it's an interest of yours as well. But if we think about, when you hear about autophagy on the internet, we think that it's just you turn on the switch and it's just this uniform process, but there's a lot of subtypes of autophagy, and mitophagy is one of them. There's xenophagy, which is how you actually catabolize viruses as well. So there's all these different subtypes of autophagy. Lipophagy, which is how you break down fat. So it's fascinating. But anyway, so mitophagy is a process of taking those kind of rusty, squeaky mitochondria that really are not, they're kind of old, so to speak, and they should be broken down into their constituents. And so mitophagy is this process that helps to break down those cellular components and proteins and membranes and so forth that can be reused to make new healthy mitochondria. Well, it turns out if people are snacking all the time, if they're not exercising, if they have elevated levels of glucose and insulin from eating ultra-processed, hyper-palatable food, then those mitochondria never get that signal by way of mitophagy to undergo this healthy renewal process. And so that's what's really interesting. And I think this is why I'm such a proponent of exercise. Like, I've personally benefited a lot from intermittent fasting and eating low carb, but the people that are more physically fit can get away with fasting less to get a different, a more proportional increase in autophagy. So which is related to mitophagy. So there was one study that tracked intermittent fasting for 36 hours in overweight individuals who didn't exercise versus lean people who did exercise. And so they looked for autophagy initiation factors in both of those individuals, doing muscle biopsies and so forth. And what they found is that in the people that regularly exercised compared to the sedentary overweight controls, in 36 hours, there was like a 300% increase in autophagy initiation proteins, which again are linked to mitophagy that we're talking about, compared to the individuals who were overweight. Okay. So your degree of so-called fitness amplifies the benefits of intermittent fasting. And that to me is pretty exciting, because a lot of people hear about fasting, they think that, okay, I got to fast for 7 days. We're like, well, maybe if you're morbidly obese, to get the benefits of autophagy, but if you lift weights regularly, if you walk with your kids, if you go to the park, you go hiking, maybe just a periodic 36-hour fast, or even just an 18-hour intermittent fast can get to that same sort of beneficial autophagy and mitophagy related processes. So I'm a huge fan. We can dive into early time-restricted feeding and all of that and talk about some studies linked with longevity there. But yeah, I think it's super interesting because, again, it's free, it's accessible. Yeah. Even if people don't have the means or the resources to go out and buy healthier food, if you just eat in a more confined short window, 6 hours, then you can get the benefits by changing the substrates in your blood. So kind of the three hormonal, sort of the recipe to induce mitophagy or autophagy: low blood glucose, low blood insulin, and high glucagon. And the way that we can increase, create this sort of hormonal cocktail that initiates autophagy is by exercising when we're fasted. So just first thing in the morning, you have an early dinner, maybe you eat before 6 or 7, something along those lines. Go out and go for a walk, or go do some yoga like first thing in the morning, and that can deplete your glycogen, which will trigger this process by decreasing blood glucose, dropping insulin, and raising glucagon. And that recipe triggers it sort of initiates the autophagy related processes. So
you're making it sound very simple, just like let's finish our dinner at a certain time, get some good sleep, wake up in the morning, do a little bit of exercise, then enjoy the rest of your day, have a little something to eat. It sounds very doable. And like you said, it's free to activate these systems. And I love the fact that this integrates it. What this really marries with is these are the things that our genes expect us to do in the first place. We evolved having times of feasting and times of fasting. Yeah. And now today, obviously, we don't have that built in. And culturally, working with my son. So my son, we were just talking about this. Yeah. I'm teaching him a nutritional science class as part of his homeschooling program. Since, the environment has kind of put us in this position, now I get to really teach him the stuff that I should be teaching him anyways, that he should be learning in his educational institution, but it's nothing remotely close. And we were talking about, because he was asking, why do we eat these certain foods at breakfast in our culture? I was like, so what do people typically eat? Like, he's been to events with me. He can see, like, what do people put out at the event at the hotel? It's muffins, bagels. We've got
orange juice.
We've got the, low-fat milk. We've got pancakes, waffles, cereal, all of these very, very carbohydrate-dense, sugar-dense substances to start the day, right? And he's just asking, like, why do, and I gave him an example, what if somebody eats some fish for breakfast or eats a salad for breakfast? And he's just looking like, what? That sounds so weird. I was like, why does it sound weird? It's because of our cultural programming as to what we tend to eat at each meal. And also part of our cultural programming is the fact that we eat so frequently in our culture. One of the studies that I talked about in Eat Smarter, it just tracked a bunch of folks and found the average person's eating about 15 hours a day, throughout that span. And simply by having folks to compress that eating window from 15 to 10 to 12 hours, folks, without restricting calories, by the way, lost weight, became more insulin sensitive, improvements in leptin, the list goes on, just by compressing that eating window. So this is really remarkable. And again, something our genes expect us to do. And I want to lean into this because, again, the benefits are seen greater when we are more fit, when we're physically fit, active, lifting weights, doing a little bit of walking. This is the part I want to lean into more because there's some more data now about exercise being a absolutely critical component of protection against this virus that's on everybody's minds.
It's crazy. And again, this should be front page news. And I want to get to that, but just kind of dovetail off what you were saying with your son. It's amazing how like our kids are sponges, so speaking of this, compressing the feeding window and snacking, like we've been, not formally as the way that you have yet, but just kind of tacitly, through our own talking in the family dinner table and so forth. My daughter's 9. So the other night we were coming back from doing something, we were mountain biking or whatever, and it was 8:00. And I was like, man, I'm getting kind of hungry. Nez, what do you want for dinner? She's like, Dad, it's too late to eat dinner right now. And so she was trying to educate. Wow. So they pick up on this stuff. So I think it's so important, like what you're doing, and we should all be doing this because, the studies from the CDC actually just showed, and the American or Journal of the American Medical Association found that kids have gained the rate of which obesity has been increasing doubled from, it was like January 2020 to just now. Oh. So during COVID, and this is from the CDC. This isn't the Journal of Conspiracy Theories research. So because kids have been stuck at home, not exercising, they are getting more and more overweight. And it happened, the categories of kids that were overweight or already obese, they were the most severely affected by that. So I think it's so important, especially because this concept of recidivism, meaning that if you gain weight, it's harder to take that weight. Your body wants to maintain that metabolic homeostatic point. So it's really hard to lose.
Especially in childhood.
Exactly.
Right.
It wants to hang on. So it's very unlikely that those kids will be spontaneously lean later in life.
Right.
Anyway, so really important for parents, and I think this should be, because we know that, the collateral damage linked with obesity, especially starting out at that age where atherosclerosis starts, the formation of the narrowing of the arteries at age 4, right? So really important stuff, but getting back to your question about exercise, this was considered a conspiracy theory, right? That exercise could somehow improve outcomes when it comes to this current public health problem. And, last time in April when we were on, the Kaiser Permanente study of 48,000 subjects showed that regular exercise was linked with reduced odds of ending up in the hospital, ending up in the ICU, and even dying. But since then, many more studies have come out in China, South Korea. One was like 1.3 million individuals in the Swedish army, what they tracked objective strength out proxies and so forth from going back to the 50s. This study was super fascinating. So they had all these like objective, strength tests and things like that for people in the military. And they retroactively then went back and looked at that data and then found, any correlation with outcome when it comes to COVID. And the people that were stronger and more physically active way back when they were like teenagers and in their early 20s had lower odds of dying and being severely impacted by COVID in Sweden. So this was super fascinating. Another study in China, and this was early in the pandemic, but the paper was just recently published. It was 164 individuals. And what they found is, when they were in the hospital, the researchers, they had this idea to conduct this study. So they asked individuals, how much do you exercise? And then how intense is that exercise? So exercise insufficiency was if you did not, in terms of minutes per week, if you did not exercise for at least 150 minutes per week in divided doses, and then the other proxy was less than 75 minutes of vigorous intensity exercise throughout the week. And what they found is that in the groups that recorded regular physical activity, 0% of them died, compared to, it was like 7% of individuals who recorded that they were inactive, right? So the rates of death, the odds ratio was like 6.7 times greater in the people who were physically inactive compared to the people who were physically active. And again, this should be front page news.
That's a massive difference.
Huge. But again, this was like, no, I don't remember hearing CNN or any of the legacy media outlets talking about this. And, and so tons of data on exercise. And I think it comes back to mechanistically, it's like, hey, well, okay, how does this work? And we can then dive into how exercise shapes the immune system and this really healthy, this part of your adaptive immune system called the T cell. And it turns out that people that regularly exercise have lower percentages of senescent T cells. And we can define all that sort of stuff in a moment. So that's one aspect. We know that the mitochondria are increased. We talked about mitophagy. And I don't know if I totally made this very clear, but exercise is one of the best ways to increase autophagy and mitophagy. So when people think about autophagy, like you mentioned, just want to button this up. Exercise is arguably one of the better ways to do it. So we obviously think about fasting first when it comes to autophagy, but various studies have shown that how we get the adaptations from exercise, like, okay, you go crush it at CrossFit, right? Your muscles are burning. That recovery and those adaptations that help your muscles become stronger for the next workout session are mediated by this process of autophagy. So that's what's cool. When you get sore, you're like, all right, I know that autophagy is kicking in to help those damaged proteins recover and repair. So anyway, the mechanisms are fascinating. But to me, the T cell and this links with the immunity, because you said it eloquently, Shawn, is, our metabolism and our immunity are basically two sides of the same coin, and they're interconnected. And that's why we see so many different diseases linked with diabetes, or insulin resistance, from dementia, Alzheimer's, heart disease, fatty liver disease, cancer, autoimmunity. And as we continue to talk about the sort of immunometabolism model, which this is so fascinating to me. And I know it sounds confusing and like intimidating, immunometabolism, but it's this idea that our immune system and our metabolic system are really two sides of the same coin. And so if you think about someone that has an autoimmune disease or cancer, so these are diseases that are dysregulated by the immune system. They're characterized by immune system dysfunction. If you give those individuals a classic metabolic supportive drug like metformin, their conditions get better. The inverse is also true. You take a diabetic, type 2 diabetic, that has inflammation. You give them a drug that helps reduce and affect their immune system, their diabetes gets better. So we've been looking at medicine through this sort of compartmentalized spectrum, right? If you have a brain disorder, you go to the psychiatrist or the neurologist. If you have a cardiovascular issue, you go to the cardiologist. But it turns out that all these organs crosstalk and intercommunicate. So immunometabolism, I think, it's with COVID going on, it's a great time to sort of talk about it, because it helps us better understand tangible ways to improve the health of our population and reduce vulnerabilities. Because if you become more metabolically healthy, you improve the resilience of your immune system. And one of the really interesting case in points about this, and we can go back to exercise and the T cells, is there's a drug that's been used with great success when it comes to treating diabetes called metformin. Metformin, I know people have this perception that drugs are inherently bad. If there's one drug that you can pick, that would be the one. In fact, a lot of people that are promoting longevity take metformin maybe every other day or something, and we can dive into natural.
Prophylactically, in a sense.
Yeah. Have you ever taken it by chance?
I have not, no. Of course, I've worked with many, many people taking metformin. And we talked about this with David Sinclair. It's kind of like the pinnacle of longevity research right now. And metformin, that's one of the things that's added to his regimen.
Yeah, metformin and rapamycin, which we can get into. But anyway, to me, it's fascinating. Well, that drug was actually developed to treat influenza, which is crazy. So to treat
what do you know? Stop it, Mike. Stop it.
I was diving into this, and I was blown away. So that's what it was initially studied to be effective for. And then it turns out that it also helps lower blood sugar. So that to me is just so fascinating. Like well, how mechanistically does this work? And it turns out it affects the mitochondria. That's how metformin works. And then we just kind of talked about earlier about how the mitochondria are involved in the innate immune system response and interferon. So anyway, this stuff is really fascinating to me. So the take-home message, I think, for people listening is we need to have better control over our blood sugar. And so just going down to your local drugstore, CVS or Walgreens, get a blood glucose meter, start to check in. Just like people check their bank account every day, or they should. People check into their FICO score, their credit score. Why aren't you checking in on your blood glucose levels and also looking at your hemoglobin A1C levels? Because these are now both accessible at home with little test, little finger 29 gauge little needle. It's not very painful, and you can check into these things. And once you're aware that, like a lot of people think they're eating healthy. Like, yeah, I have croutons in my salad. I have a little bread, but I'm pretty healthy. And then you look at your glucose and you're like, wow, my fasting glucose is 120 or 110. Okay, maybe I need to rethink and change my diet and lifestyle in a different way. Yeah. Anyway.
I love that analogy of people checking their bank account and credit score. What about your metabolic bank account? Take a peek at that. That's so great. And there's so many powerful things there. I want to circle back to the aspect with kids and what we're seeing, because this is a particular passion of both of ours. And one of the reasons we're working so hard right now is to protect our children. And seeing this rapid increase in obesity in our kids like that so quickly, this is a demonstration of, because this was one of the big things propped up, can't get people healthier overnight. You can really mess people up overnight, and we can get healthier overnight. It's not going to be perfect, but right now we're really, the longer that this goes on, as you mentioned, this is kind of setting the template. It's going to make it much more difficult for our children to be able to reach and sustain a place of health by pushing them into these conditions that, again, they're not choosing to be obese. They're growing up in these conditions that is making this just a norm, So thank you so much for bringing that up and talking about that. And I want to talk a little bit more about the T cells and NK cells in regards to exercise. So what do these things do for us, the T cells, NK cells?
Great question. So the T cells are part of your adaptive immunity. So when we talked about the interferon and the mitochondria as like a frontline part of your immune system, your immune system is kind of bifurcated into the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system. So the innate immune system doesn't really have much memory. It's either stimulated or it's not. So you get a cut, a laceration, you get an infection. Your innate immune system is first on the scene. It's like an ambulance, first responder. It's going to help recruit other cells that are necessary. But your adaptive immune system has all the memory. And so your T cells are part of your adaptive immune system. And in fact, they're part of what help us, if people have had COVID like myself and hundreds of millions of people probably here in the US, what helps us sort of surmount an appropriate adaptive immune response is these T cells. And they crosstalk and help create antibodies as well. So this is what's fascinating to me. When you turn on the media, we hear all about antibodies. So antibodies, but it's really the T cells that help mediate the B cells to make antibodies. Like they are really intimately involved in various aspects of aging and also the immune response. But it turns out that our T cell repertoire starts to decline as we age. And so there's this gland called our thymus gland, which is around anatomically near the thyroid. And we undergo this process of what's known as thymic involution. And so this thymus starts to shrink and shrink. And again, it's very important because these T cells regulate so many aspects of our immune system and health and longevity. And that's where they originate, in the thymus gland. Now, it turns out that the rate at which this thymus atrophy or involution occurs is variable based upon our lifestyle. So if we start smoking cigarettes, if we start drinking a bottle of wine every night, if we're not exercising, if we're hitting up Chick-fil-A and McDonald's, the rate at which our thymus gland atrophies is increased or accelerated. And that leads to a functionally impaired set of T cells called immunosenescence. And so these T cells can become senescent. A senescent cell is a cell that should apoptose and die, but it doesn't. And so essentially, all of our cells have a finite lifespan. And as we age, we get more and more dysfunctional or senescent cells. And so this kind of helps us better understand chronologic aging versus biologic aging. So we've all met 40-year-olds and we go, dang, what are you doing? Like, you look great. Shawn, I want to know what you're eating. What are you doing? And then we've met people who are 32 and you think they're like 45, right? So that is the difference between biologic aging and chronologic aging. And I think this is important. And we've heard about this where we see a perfectly healthy 40-year-old in the hospital. And we see the media talk about this perfectly healthy person. And we see the picture and we're like, that to me doesn't look like perfectly healthy. They look a lot older than they appear to be. That is because they're biologically aging faster. And these T cells are involved in this aging process, and senescent cells and so forth. So when we regularly exercise, getting back to exercise and T cells, we help to purge the percentage of senescent T cells in our body and in our immune system, and we decrease that. So exercise is a way to sort of take out the trash and get rid of these senescent T cells. Now that is very important because these senescent cells are kind of like, they're like bad kids. Those kids that your parents didn't want you to hang out with, they cause you to do bad things. And so these senescent cells they have what's known as a senescence-associated secretory phenotype. It's a big word, I know. Just understand that they're secreting almost like pheromones. I'm oversimplifying, but they're secreting like a pheromone-like molecule that cause your healthy cells to become senescent too. So you want to get rid of those cells. And the way that you purge them, the way that you hit the eject button or whatever, the garbage disposal, is by exercising and intensely. So when you exercise intensely, you get some oxygen debt created, you deplete that glycogen outgrow those senescent T cells. And so various studies over the years have looked at the percentage of senescent T cells in aged individuals over the age of 65, in individuals who exercise versus don't. And there's a much lower percentage of these so-called dysfunctional senescent T cells. And this is linked with better functionality as you age. And what's interesting, if you look, and this was early on in COVID, like in March of 2020, I had this hypothesis, I was reading this research and I was looking at this and I'm like, this seems like there is, because you see these 50-year-olds with all these chronic diseases who are dying. I was wondering if biologic age is impacting this. Yeah. And there's been a load of studies that have come out that shows that biologic age, which is how you assay this, is partly by these T cells and these senescent cells, is a risk factor for COVID. So if you have all these different chronic diseases, high blood pressure, ages, your cells, obesity, all these diseases help to accelerate the biologic aging process and create this inflammaging situation. So as you age, you naturally become more inflamed. It's called inflammaging. It's not a made up word. And part of that inflammaging process occurs by way of these senescent cells. So I know I'm repeating myself here. The bottom line is exercise, eat a healthy whole root food diet. And then we can get into NK cells later. Like you mentioned, I have obese people in my life that don't exercise, that don't do anything for themselves, whether it's knowledge, awareness, whatever, motivation. They are the people that probably should take the vaccine, but I'll share with you which one I think has at least unintended harm. So there's like 3 different kind of delivery systems that are available right now. We just heard that Johnson & Johnson this week was pulled. Maybe we can talk about that one. That one I'm least excited about, and I would not take that if it becomes mandatory or whatever. So what they're doing is they're taking a recombinant adenovirus, so it's just a standard sort of benign virus. They're engineering it so that it can't replicate, and they're inserting the spike protein DNA inside that adenovirus. So you get it injected into your deltoid.
So they're using a virus to protect you from a virus.
Dude, it's crazy. But I mean, it's funny that, just small side story, all the people that were like, I'm only eating gluten-free foods, avoid GMOs, they're taking the selfie with these sort of vaccines that they don't realize like how much geoengineering and genetics is going into this. But yeah, so this replication defunct adenovirus gets into your own nucleus, which is where genomics and genetic expression happens. And it causes your own genes, it's giving you the genetic information to then make this spike protein, which is the extracellular protein on the surface of the SARS-CoV-2 virus that enables it to get inside your cells. So to me, that seems like there's a lot of unknowns there. You're getting this virus that's injecting DNA into your own cells. I don't like that idea. And so not a big fan of that. The other one that I don't think it's as bad. It's not yet available. It's in phase 2. It's this Novovax, which is this protein subunit technology. So essentially how vaccines sort of work, some of these traditional vaccines, is they'll give you an adjuvant to irritate your immune system. Like they tried to give this to our children, hepatitis B, when children are born, even though you get hepatitis from unprotected sex or IV drugs. But for some reason, the CDC wants newborns to get this. So in that vaccine is a bunch of aluminum to irritate your immune system. And then there will be this protein that's like hepatitis B antigen. So your immune system will remember that next time you're exposed. Well, this company, the drug is called Novovax. They're doing something similar where they've made this spike protein recombinantly in a lab, and they have this saponin from a tree bark. So to me, it seems the cleanliness is probably the best out of all of them. So you're getting this injected, you're agitating your dendritic cells and your sort of antigen presenting cells. You're giving them on a silver platter this protein subunit, the spike protein. And then your immune system is saying, hey, if we see that again, we will mount a response. So if that becomes available in the US, that would be the one that I think would probably, like I said, I have immunity, not planning on getting the vaccine, but for folks that are elderly, for folks that have been smoking for 20 years, it might be a good idea. Now, the technology that's available right now, at least here, that's been approved through this emergency use authorization, is this microRNA that's encapsulated in this polyethylene glycol nanoparticle. And we'll talk about that. So essentially, you're getting injected. And, you've talked about on the show epigenetics, and you talk about it in your book. So I know listeners are familiar, but just in brief, you have genes that have DNA. They are transcribed into RNA, And then that is sort of translated into the language of protein. And that's really the basics of genetics, right? So you're getting this intermediary between protein and genes, this microRNA. And that microRNA is then your own cells will make the spike protein. So people will say that it's transgenic and all that. That technology is not like genetic engineering because you're just getting this mRNA, messenger RNA, that your ribosomes are making the spike protein. But there are shortcomings to this because if you or I naturally get exposed, there's non-structural proteins on the SARS-CoV-2 virus. There's the nucleocapsid, there's the envelope, and there's the spike protein. Our natural immune system is going to make memories towards all of these things. Now, what's going on throughout the world is there's lineages or variants that are saying, I see what you're doing. Your spike protein antibodies are there. So we're going to figure out through mutations to get around that.
That's what viruses do.
That's what they do, man. So, dude, we are, and again, I haven't heard anyone talk about this. This is me, so I could be wrong. But I really think we're creating selective pressure to further exacerbate these advantageous mutations, where this virus will then have a better way to evade these spike protein antibodies in memory because we don't have the redundancy, like I mentioned. I have, nucleocapsid antibodies, and they're actually quantitatively higher than the spike protein antibodies. So it's like we've sort of pharmacologically created this way to commercialize an immune response, but it has shortcomings because it's not as robust and there's not redundancies. Yeah. You got a question?
Yeah, no, I think it's just we have a lot of hubris to think that we can outsmart viruses, which are, again, when you mentioned earlier, one of the technologies, bacteriophages. So viruses that infect bacteria, like this has been used in treatments for quite some time, but at the end of the day, viruses are beyond, really, we don't really even understand what they are. The top virologist in the world knows less than a fraction of a percent of all the viruses there are. It's the most dominant thing on planet Earth. There are more viruses than anything. And so they're incredible. It's fascinating, but at the same time, the hubris to think that we can just do this thing, which is, the funny thing is, and this is what I want to ask you about, we're trying to implant a technology that makes our cells believe that they are infected or make your cells to produce the spike protein. But is it the same as this virus? That should be the first question. It's similar enough, right?
Right.
So why are they not using the virus itself? Riddle me that, Batman.
Dude, that would be the way. If you could somehow make SARS-CoV-2 just like they make the adenovirus vector replication defective, that would be the way to do it. But yet, why aren't they? I don't know. I mean, this is a really good question. I don't know the answers to these, man. But to me, it seems like it's short-sighted, and I worry about, okay, if everyone's doing this, and this virus figures out, okay, I see you, spike protein. We're replicating so fast. We're going to make mistakes in our replication. We're going to mutate. We're going to figure out. So I worry what's going to happen like next winter. We may not see this in the summer, but because some people might be undergoing a viral infection, they might be exposed to SARS-CoV-2, then they get the vaccine. So it's already figuring out, probably they see it and maybe it's killing some virus, but for others, it's able to evade that. And so the B117 variant is good at doing that. The other lineage, the B1.35 variant, is also good at that. And this is why health matters even more, because you need your innate immune system. This is the thing. So it's like the antibody response, you and I get exposed to SARS-CoV-2. Spike protein doesn't raise until day 14 of infection. We really need our natural course of immunity, and the way that we can make that more resilient is with healthy living. So that should be part of the conversation. So, but just to kind of finish off the microRNA or the mRNA versions, I think this, again, to underscore healthy living, people that are unhealthy tend to have higher side effect issues with these vaccines. So if you have asthma or allergies or an autoimmune disease, some people do react to this nanoparticle sphere, the polyethylene glycol, PEG. There's some data on it. I can give it to you for the show notes. But that in and of itself is immunogenic. Like people are making antibodies to that. So you have people that have multiple sclerosis and they have high risk factors, and then you're giving them another thing to react to. So you do hear people getting side effects, and it may not even be from that spike protein from the RNA. It could be from the polyethylene glycol. So again, healthy living should be like equal in terms of its emphasis from our public health measures.
Yeah, this is so important. So good, man. Now, another thing that I just want to put on people's radar is the way that we would interact with the virus in a natural evolution of our response and adaptation to it is we have multiple facets of our body that are interacting with it. So like we're tasting it. This is like your mouth and your nose are kind of, there are immune cells there that are like sampling it and getting to know it and communicating. And the same thing goes for, your gastrointestinal tract. The list goes on and on. But now we're aggressively, very unnaturally putting it into your arm, for example, bypassing all the natural metrics of interaction. How many pieces of the conversation of your immune system are lost? And this is just a logical question. And also so I want people to think about that a little bit. And I also want folks to think about, you mentioned earlier that this isn't necessarily something that can go upstream and like change your genes, for example. But if folks know anything about epigenetics, everything that we're exposed to is influencing our genetic expression. Everything. And this is the top science. Like everything else filters down, but yet there's been this massive delay still in college textbooks changing and, kind of standard of care changing. But epigenetics is the leading science, which is we're not just under this genetic control. Like if we've got the genes for fill in the blank, it's going to happen. Whereas we know that there are almost infinite combinations of genetic expressions. So we've collectively, as humans, we've got 22,000 genes collectively, but tens of thousands of different combinations and expressions based on what we're exposed to. This is an epigenetic influencer. We don't know the long-term ramification. Like what could this mean for us? This is the other part, and this is really the big thing. And the place to be Captain Obvious is we've never seen anything like this before. There's been such a groundswell of manufacturer demand that we've bypassed all the normal policies of safety and testing that usually take years upon years upon years upon years to make sure to a degree that they're safe. But even with that, recalls every year, thousands of drug recalls every year that were deemed to be safe after years of testing. This is normal. That's how it is. And so now this, to say that with certainty, we know it's going to happen, we don't know. Every person doing this, you are taking a substantial risk. You are taking a risk. Now, it might be a calculated risk that you weigh yourself based on your perception of threat with this virus. But that gets back into the conversation of how susceptible are you really? Because even folks, we've talked about the susceptibility factors being, chronic pre-existing diseases, but even then, still a lot of folks don't have any symptoms who are obese, who do have hypertension, or they don't have severe infections to the degree we see. And this term wasn't even used before, which is survival rate, right? We got to take out. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
I'm with you 100% on all this stuff. But let's first talk about the epigenetic thing. And I'm so glad you mentioned that because I've been thinking about that and I've been trying to have that conversation with people. And they're kind of like, either they don't understand epigenetics or so that is the thing that we don't really understand is like, RNA, like microRNA causes epigenetic changes, right? In addition to methylation groups on histones and all of these things, which are the intricacies of how our DNA is sort of compacted. So what epigenetic effects is these new proteins having or their delivery system having on genetic expression, short-term and long-term? So these are huge unanswered questions, man. And the fact that people who like Portlandia type people who said like, well, I'll have a grass-fed beef, but what was the cow's mom's name? Like, like you're just willingly just going in head first with this, like, like you said, but the risk of your chances of dying, especially if you're under 65 is infinitesimally small. Now, of course, that increases with risk factors and so forth. But even the study that I was telling you with Kaiser Permanente, with exercise, 48,000 subjects were tracked. The chances of hospitalization, and that was a wide cohort of people, was only 8%. So you're like, the media has made it out to be because they focus on the number of deaths. If we telescoped in on the number of deaths from suicide, the number of deaths of heart disease, 3.7 times more people died in 2020 from cancer and heart disease combined. Yet we're doling out foods and chemicals that directly create heart disease and cancer every single day. And people, eat this stuff with their own volition. So yeah, this idea of like, yeah, survivability and all that. I mean, it's really interesting to sort of unpack that. But the relative risk for most people is pretty small, if we're being honest. The risk of having a severe outcome, and actually it follows kind of this 80-20 principle. If we think about our life, like we spend 80% of our time with 20% of the people in our life. When we go out to dinner, we 80% of the time we go the same 20% in the restaurants. Well, if you look at the people, 80% of people that get exposed to this are just fine. It's the 20% of those people, and then it applies the flip side. The 20% who go to the hospital, about 80% of them are totally okay. So it's a small, very small percentage. So yeah, in that risk analysis that you mentioned, should I get the shot or not? Should I double mask or should I stay home? We really need to be doing more risk analysis for people. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, and this is, I'm so grateful to have you here because we could talk about this stuff, because both you and I'm not anti anything. I'm just pro logic. I'm pro science. I'm pro looking at all parts of it. And I'm pro acknowledging my biases. I have a bias towards things that my genes expect me to do. Like the longest, like from what we know, just basic things. My genes expect me to move. My genes expect me to eat real food. Once we start to stray away from those things, we're going to have symptoms of disease and disorder. It's very logical. So anything that doesn't fit in that paradigm, I have a bias that pops up, but they're able to check it, because just like, okay, I know that, but maybe this thing is this effective. Let me investigate it and have an open mind, open heart for it. However, in this situation, you just mentioned, what folks are eating. There's entire fields of this. And this is what I really wanted to push forward in Eat Smarter is nutrigenomics and nutrigenetics. We know this stuff already, but everyday folks don't know. And this is the big part. Most clinicians don't know about this, because folks don't realize when they're saying, what type of degree does somebody have, that they're being indoctrinated in a certain way of thinking. And if anything doesn't fit within that model, it's automatically negated or ignored. Like you literally, I know a lot of people feel this, like you share a piece of data and it's just like people literally can't even see it. Like, no, it's not true. It doesn't fit into my model of reality. And it's a protective mechanism, like nobody wants to feel like somebody's lying to them. And so this gets into the conversation about, even though there is a threat, absolutely. I had on an epidemiologist who is not only an epidemiologist, but somebody who's worked with multiple states in creating the health policies for their states. Wow. All right. And he's also run several organizations himself. So I was like, he's also in that vein, the thought process of how is shutdowns of business and the economy, how do all these things play in? And one of the things that he shared with me that any epidemiologist worth their salt would know is that he was actually okay with the fact that people are getting tested. He knew, because the thing is, like, we're testing healthy people. What is this going to do to the numbers? But for him, it's just like, once we have all these numbers, it's going to make the fatality exponentially lower, right? But what he shared with me is that once we have a certain number of confirmed cases within a population, it's like right now, I think in the U.S., how many do we have? Like
over 20 million?
Yes, maybe 30.
Yeah,
right
higher. Yeah, probably.
On average, any epidemiologist would know there's 10 to 15 times more folks who've actually contracted the illness. So now, what does that do to the number? It just puts it in perspective. Now, with that said, I think the reason that we're so on hyper alert, and this is the obvious thing, is what are we being inundated with? What are all the messages telling us? And there are people who are on the front lines and they've seen some terrible things. The vast majority of people are okay. There hasn't been a survival ticker. There hasn't been a no symptom ticker. It's only just talking about cases and deaths without context even. So can you add in a little bit there? Because I think that that's one of the big issues to traverse, to move past in weighing this out. Like, what is the actual threat here? And what is the potential downside of doing this very experimental thing that's never been done before in human history? Let's give some consideration to.
I'm with you 100%. What I like to do is just look at common sense numbers throughout the world and just look at, say, okay, well, what's the case fatality ratio in various countries in Africa? What about India? Like what, because we know that as a population, Obviously, there's outliers, people like you and I and everyone in this room. We're healthy, we make intentional choices, but a lot of people don't. Those people are more susceptible, but even then, if you think about it, there's 300, just do very simple math, 330 million people in the US. Okay, how many people died in 2020? It was like 370,000 from SARS-CoV-2. 90+% of those people had multiple chronic conditions, 2 or more chronic conditions. And it was like 80% of those people were over the age of 65. The life expectancy in the US is 77 years old. So, if we look at loss of life sucks, death sucks, absolutely. But we can't stop the entire world and scare everyone into living their life. All the time. We need to focus on quality adjusted life years. This is what epidemiologists talk about. So how can we maximize the quality adjusted life years? And what is the potential of your quality adjusted life years if you don't have disease? If you're free of hypertension, you're not overweight, you're not diabetic, your risk of actually dying is really, really small. So I just think that should be the message. And you can reduce that probability by making healthy living like your part-time job, walking to work, going out, spending time with your kids. There's multiple facets of that. And then should we address, communities that are more susceptible? Let's put community gardens in there. Let's get the Jack in the Box and all the subsidized cheap food out of there, because obviously that's exacerbating the problem. So, but then the other argument is people will say, well, you don't want to get this virus at all because of the chronic long-term effects and all that. And I could understand that, but those chronic, lingering, long-hauling effects really are people that have health issues going into it, that already have autoimmunity, that could be improved by their diet and lifestyle. So I think either way, like you could have an argument with the most, vaccinated mask proponent and still both agree that healthy living should be the path forward. It's sustainable, it's accessible to most people, and we should be allocating those funds, like you talked about, to these communities that don't have access to real food and exercise or a sauna. Like, what can we do to help them instead of just say shots, more shots? Because
you sound like Little John.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So I don't know the answers to all these public health issues, but I think we also need to look at what's sustainable, with this. And these face masks, it's funny to see all these environmentalists like pivot towards like everyone should face mask, and then you see these things in the ocean.
Oh man, it is
me.
bad.
Yeah,
it is really bad. It's not good. And this is, I think, the most glaring example of all of this stuff is highlighted by the CDC, which is who the director stuff to. If you post something, stay up to date with the CDC. People aren't really looking at the data on the CDC. And, their most recent report, which just blows my mind, 94% of the folks who lost their lives with COVID on the death certificate had an average of 3.8 pre-existing chronic diseases and or comorbidities. All right, now, and it's right there on the site, but that leaves that 6% who were, quote, perfectly healthy. And you just mentioned something about, the folks that are experiencing oftentimes severe infections, long COVID. Yes, predominantly, these are folks with these pre-existing conditions. But there is the percentage is so small, but that's who the media likes to put on the news, right? And that really needs an asterisk by it, because this definition of what is health and what is perfectly healthy in our culture is an absence of a diagnosis. And also not understanding basic human biology and physiology, which is, even if I'm the healthiest person in my city, if I'm sleep deprived, or if I'm really stressed, like, I'm worried about something with my family, I'm worried about what's going on in the world. Now there's a lot of studies coming out about the psychosomatic effects of COVID. I can suppress my immune function dramatically, and I can increase my susceptibility to contracting the infection and my outcome. Just like that. It doesn't matter if I'm, quote, perfectly healthy. That's just an absence of a diagnosis. So any of us can get sick from anything, and most often it's from something we're already carrying around with us. We refer to these opportunistic microorganisms. Everybody has an array of them. And my first question that I think we should ask is like, why? Do they do something good for me? Maybe. Is it just like we're painting it like these are bad bacteria, these are good bacteria, bad viruses, good viruses? Or does everything play a role and I just don't understand my place in this, right? And I'm just going to outsource my thinking and my health to somebody else. So That's a lot in a nutshell. And this is leading to this other conversation. I'm so pumped. I would ask you so many things, but you mentioned our excessive response in being, sanitizing everything and hand sanitizers and the impact that it has on our microbiome. Our microbiome isn't just in our gut. We have an array of bacteria that live in and on our bodies that protect us from pathogens, that protect us from viruses. So you've got some data on the effectiveness of hand sanitizers that you shared recently too.
That to me is crazy. Seeing it's mostly parents that are like, forcing it onto their kids. And so, yeah, this was a study. Actually, it was a Canadian pediatrics journal. I can't remember the exact name of the journal, but I'll give it to you for the show notes. And they actually showed that there was a correlation between homes, how much sanitizer they bought and used within the household, and childhood obesity. So there was independent of other factors. So higher childhood obesity. And then they did some gut microbiome analysis on the children and found different species. And there's a bunch of different species that are correlated with obesity and sanitizer use. So like you said, I mean, we are living microorganisms. Like you and I have created this microbiome cloud as we're talking, right? And so to think that we're just going to constantly put this stuff on our hands, and be free of all pathogens forever, I think it's just short-sighted. And again, not looking at the unintended harm, right? So you have these parents that are concerned about the media or whatever. They see the death ticker. So they're, and so we had this just small little side story in my neighborhood, because schools were closed in Washington. So we did this pods thing, which was a local group with like 5 or 6 kids. And I started to ask my daughter, well, so were you guys playing outside? It was this mom, bless her heart, really nice lady. And she said, yeah, Dad, but before we went outside, we had to put on sanitizer. And then we went and played outside, and then we had to put on sanitizer again. And then we had to wash our hands. And I'm like, well, how many times were you doing this a day? She's like 6 or 7. I'm like, well, why didn't you tell me this earlier? Like, so, you add that up. Maybe once, that's not a big deal one day. But you do that 3 or 4 or 5. Now we're at 13 months in. What are the issues with that, right? And these things are transdermally absorbing. It's not
Where do they go? They just disappear because your skin is sucking it all right up.
Man, so I worry about this stuff because, the developing microbiome really sort of, obviously it changes in real time. If we go eat McDonald's or we eat healthy, real food, it's going to change. But children's microbiome, it starts to become more stable when they're young, right? And it depends on all those inputs. So I really worry about that. So I just would encourage parents and everything like that. If you're worried about your kids, just run some hot water, or do something along those lines. But yeah, we got to start to think about the consequences.
Right. The study that you shared, it was Science of the Total Environment. So we'll put that in the show notes for everybody. The title of the study was COVID-19 and Frequent Use of Hand Sanitizers, Human Health and Environmental Hazards by Exposure Pathways. And the craziest thing is, and this is one of the things that it bothers me a little bit, is the quote, unintended consequences. Right? Or surprising consequences. This shit isn't a surprise. We knew these things would happen. Like, and full disclosure, my wife, when COVID landed here, she went and she got the family size hand sanitizer.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, babe, do you remember who we are? Like, let's just pump the brakes a little. But she felt it, right. Like this is what everybody's doing. We really need to make sure we're killing the germs. And so I just immediately went and pulled up some of the data on these things and even lawsuits from these various companies for, basically making false claims about what they're able to do in the context of viruses, for example, which viruses are so much smarter than the hand sanitizer. Now, they're, whatever kind of shell they're encased in, some hand sanitizers do break through some types of viruses, but it's still this very myopic thinking about our relationship to our environment and not understanding we are all of that stuff. We have 400 trillion virus particles in and on our bodies that we know about. And not to mention the microbiome, right? All the fungi we carry around and the bacteria, the archaea, the list goes on and on. We're just a walking, talking microbe factory ourselves, So the question is, what are we doing to the ones that are protecting our skin, for example? And what the data is really leaning towards is we're actually creating a situation where we're more susceptible to assimilating something through our hands because they're not even protected. They don't have the layer of protection anymore because we burn that shit off with all these crazy chemical hand sanitizers. It's the wildest thing.
And beyond that too, I mean, and driving the formation of staphylococcus and different Clostridia that are resistant to sanitization. And so we're creating like superbugs, you know? And so, yeah, it's just crazy to me that, like you said, I mean, I think humans, we learn through observation. And so if you go to Costco or you go to Whole Foods and you see people just freaking out buying all this stuff and sanitizer, you think, well, gosh, maybe I should be doing that too. I'm an irresponsible mother if I don't buy this. So I can see sort of people getting into it, but you need to realize, like you said, we've lost sight of the fact that our host is modifiable. Like our being, we can make our immune system resilient by our choices, our mindset, our sleep. And going back to what you were saying, like there's 6% of people or whatever that didn't have a diagnosed comorbidity. They could have just had this weird window of opportunity. Some of those people could have never. I know a lot of friends that haven't been to a doctor or had blood work in 20 years. So you can't tell me like, oh, I'm free of everything. Like you don't really know. If you haven't had your blood work, you don't test your blood pressure at home, you don't test your glucose. So there's some of that, but there probably were, some healthy people that were stressed out, that weren't sleeping, that just broke up with their girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever, lost their job. And they created they reduced the resiliency of their host response. So we don't know all those stories.
Here's a study. It was Appalachian State University. Just going for a short walk, 20 or 30 minute walk. You get an instantaneous boost in your immune parameters, most notably for those NK cells, which appear to have some really good effects at protection from SARS-CoV-2.
Yeah. I mean, again, this is part of the innate immune system, super important for health in general, but especially this virus. And a series of studies have come out on this, like you're talking about, just exercise, forest bathing, all of that, even vitamin D. And so this was an interesting study in South Korea. I think there was like 200,000 individuals in this electronic medical record that was part of this study. And they looked at all these, maybe it was more like 180, whatever. It was a lot of people. And they found that there was a correlation with adverse outcomes when it comes to this virus, and also exercise levels and vitamin D levels with this critically important cell that you just mentioned, the natural killer cells. So again, this should be front page news, because the levels of vitamin D that are, if you go to your mainstream doctor, right, and they don't know anything about integrated medicine, as long as your levels are like 32 nanograms per ml, they're going to be like, you don't have a deficiency, so you probably don't need to take any vitamin D. But what this study actually showed is that your levels, from an optimal standpoint for natural killer cell activity, that's what they looked at, is the activity. How functional are these important cells, like to go out and, like Pac-Man, seek and destroy and kill the bad guys and so forth, infected cells and whatnot. So it was about, levels were between 55 and 60 nanograms per ml on the vitamin D level. So, and then also, exercise, more wasn't always better. That's kind of interesting, because we've seen on the media, oh, well, this marathon runner got really sick. Like exercise, like anything in life, exerts or adheres to this U-shaped curve phenomena. So there's a sweet spot where it turns out to be around a cumulative 150 minutes per week. 75 of those minutes, half of those should be moderate or pretty intense, vigorous activity. And so to me, that was fascinating, because, and this dovetails, it's perfect that you brought that up now, because we've been talking about these T cells and this thymic involution. Well, as we age, our natural killer cells become even more important for the elderly, because they don't have, their T cells are kind of weakened. So it seems that we really need to support these natural killer cells, especially in our elderly friends and family, because they don't have the T cells there to help. And that was an interesting part of that study that I thought was, I learned, what's cool about this is like, we can continue to talk about these benefits later on, after COVID, but everyone's so interested in it right now because they want to stay safe. And it just goes to show, vitamin D, you can supplement that for like $10 a month. Go out in the sun, if you live in north or southern latitudes. So there's a lot of things that we can do. And it turns out that exercise and vitamin D really support this critically important cell type.
Yeah, it's powerful. So early on, one of the first drugs that was being worked on and trying to fast track through the FDA, a lot of folks don't know this, but again, I mentioned this very early on, was a drug to target our NK cells. And it was because the data was indicating pretty clearly that our NK cells are very important, kind of standoutish aspect of our immune system in this scenario. And now that's kind of, again, been brushed under the rug. And now we're getting into a situation here now where it's become very dogmatic. And we actually have real world science on looking at natural immunity versus vaccine-induced immunity, Let's talk about that.
This is so fascinating to me because the fact that the media and all the experts that you see on television really discounted natural immunity was to me mechanistically, it didn't really make sense because, and again, I'm not an anti-vaccination person, but when you get the vaccine, it's not like you're getting an exogenous immune system. You're getting the antigen, which is a spike protein, for which your own natural immune system will make memory to. And so the fact that we were saying, well, the natural course of infection where you naturally get this spike protein that you'll get if you get the virus, that doesn't matter. It's only the immune system memory that's created when you get the spike protein that's made by way of a messenger RNA. So that to me was pretty interesting, that the fact that we discounted this, but now, the outcome data is coming out with regards to the differential rates between reinfection from a previous COVID infection versus a breakthrough case after you've been fully immunized. And so that study, I think there's a total of 700,000 individuals, maybe it was more in Israel. And so what's interesting about that particular study, have you covered this in depth on the show yet?
No, please do.
Dude, it's so fascinating to me. And so this, I think, was a game changer in how we should view natural immunity with regards to green passes and health passes and vaccine passports, because the rates of reinfection in individuals who had been previously exposed to SARS-CoV-2 prior to March of 2021. So they were accounting for when the Delta variant was circulating, right? It was a 13 times lower odds of reinfection compared to a breakthrough. So that was really interesting. And so it sort of makes sense mechanistically. We were talking sort of offline. Well, why would this be? We know that these vaccines can reduce disease severity and reduce risk of being hospitalized and all of that. But again, the mechanism through which these vaccines are working is on a single antigen of the virus, which is the S or spike protein. Whereas if you get the whole virus, you're getting the nucleocapsid, the envelope, you're getting the spike protein. And there's also these non-structural proteins called ORF1, ORF2. There's a lot of these. Anyway, so it's more robust and there's more redundancy. And so your T cells and your immune system is making immunologic memory to more targets, so that when your immune system see those targets, when you're getting re-exposed, it's going to react. And what was interesting, since you and I last chatted in April, so I got infected in December of 2020, I've been tracking my antibodies every 3 months. My antibodies have actually increased since from their baseline levels in December, meaning that I had gotten re-exposed, and I didn't even know it, didn't get a cold or anything. And that to me, I think, is quite fascinating. But yeah, the study in Israel was really compelling because the rates of reinfection were exceedingly low, even when the Delta variant was circulating. So again, the difference between all the different reinfection versus breakthrough infection studies that the CDC has been looking at wasn't really that data was not collected when the Delta variant was predominant. Whereas the Israel study started tracking data February 28th, I believe, to August 15th of this year. And so again, we're talking about, I think, in the unvaccinated group, yet previously exposed, there was at least 60,000 people in that arm of the study. And I think there was 400,000 individuals in the fully vaccinated arms of the study. And they got somehow infected or a breakthrough case between end of February and August. Now, what's interesting about that is, due to that data and other related studies, countries like the UK and Italy and France are accounting for natural immunity. There was an editorial piece in the British Medical Journal that said, hey, look, why is the United States one of the few sort of westernized, big medical, innovative countries when it comes to medicine? Why are we not acknowledging previous infection? Because the epidemiologists have looked at the data and figured out, and you talked about this before, we can say on a 95% confidence interval that there's been at least 95 million cases up to maybe 130 million cases. Like, we're pretty sure, even though the confirmed cases are 45 million at this point, something like that. So you're like, well, that's like a third of the population. And then why aren't we saying that these people don't need to, they're not immune until they have 2 doses or a booster or whatever? And it was interesting that this was in the British Medical Journal, actually questioning why the US and other countries like Canada are not acknowledging previous infection, given the data that the odds of a reinfection are exceedingly low.
Yeah, that's not science to ignore that And also getting us to this point is because of our immune system. To even be sitting here in these chairs as humans, to negate that natural immunity exists is just, it's beyond, it's very difficult to even comprehend that we even have to have this conversation. So to recap this, we've got, for folks who've acquired COVID, quote, in the wild, and they've developed antibodies in a spectrum of immunity, have about a 13 times percent reduced risk of reinfection versus folks who've been vaccinated.
Correct. Yeah. The probability is just much higher for a so-called breakthrough case compared to a reinfection. And again, this is data in we're not talking about 12 subjects here and 13 subjects here. We're talking about tens of, So this data, and this is during the so-called Delta variant when it's circulating. So why are we not acknowledging natural immunity? I mean, that's the thing. It's like, now, there's all these false dichotomies going on where it's either everyone has to be vaccinated or you're an anti-vaxxer, where it's there's some gray area right here. And so we're not anti-vaxxers by saying that we should account for natural immunity. I mean, if we think about, like you and I growing up, Shawn, if our cousin or our brother had chickenpox, our parents were like, okay, you need to go hang out with your cousin or brother to get the chickenpox so that you're done. Like
chickenpox party.
Yeah, chickenpox party. But I mean, now the epidemiologists and so forth, and this was even in the journal Science, right, who did the review and broke down the data from the from the Israel study in August. It was August 20th, I think, when it came out. They were saying, hey, look, we got to have caution here. We don't want a bunch of high-risk people going to a COVID party. But they essentially said in the conclusion, like, natural immunity is more robust and more long-lasting than vaccine-induced immunity. Now, what's interesting is Pfizer funded this recent research that came out last week in the New England Journal of Medicine. And again, I'm not dogging on vaccines. I'm the messenger telling you what the data said, that after 6 months, the probability of the efficacy has dropped to 20% in the vaccine. And that's not 20% for risk of death or hospitalization. That still is fairly high in terms of preventing the odds of that happening, but preventing the fully vaccinated individual after 6 months, it's the efficacy is about 20% for catching COVID, right? So you're like, okay, so we have data from other parts here in the U.S., Israel, other parts of the world, and here's what's even crazier, Shawn, is going back to the MERS outbreak in 2003 and the first SARS-CoV outbreak. We know that those individuals have natural immunity, T-cell immunity, from almost over 20 years ago. And this data is not new at all. Yeah. This has been published in 2020. And people have just gotten so sort of convinced that natural immunity doesn't matter, that it's a new virus, so it will sort of not behave like any other virus in nature. It's just going to be so different because it's new. But again, we have data showing that these T-cells that we've been talking about, they're impacted by exercise, our diet, and so forth. They're important because it seems that if you had high levels of antibodies all the time, your blood would be pretty thick and viscous, and you would be at higher risk of getting a stroke or a heart attack. So your antibodies naturally decline, but that's why your T cells are important, because they are there to tell when you get re-exposed to, say, SARS-CoV-2, your T cells are going to yell at your B cells and your plasma cells, hey, make antibodies, right? So they are the communicator. Now, here's the problem is we have not helped people improve the functionality of their T cells. So let's just pretend for a moment that these vaccines completely block COVID-19 transmission. Like you're never going to transmit the disease. We should be also encouraging people to do things to make the vaccines more effective. That's been my qualm with this as well. And it goes back to some of the drugs that we talked about, metformin. There were several studies in a drug called rapamycin, which is a known longevity enhancer, that actually improves the efficacy. That's been shown to improve the efficacy in elderly individuals getting an influenza vaccine. So we have so many ways, knowing this data, right, that after 6 months, efficacy of the vaccine has dropped to about 20% in terms of preventing an overall infection. Well, why were we recommending or endorsing tacitly that people get donuts after they get the shots? You're like, that was just not a good public health campaign. And I know the government wasn't necessarily endorsing it, but the media was saying, hey, here's a little pro bono thing. You go get your shot, you get free donuts.
Here in LA was the biggest coercion / incentive, which is, you get free food at McDonald's, burgers, fries. There's a massive lottery as well that took place. They gave away like $100 million in gift cards and lottery and all these different things, and not looking at education. And actually, again, how do we, if this is going to be an effective adjunct, what do we do to actually make sure that it's effective? Listen to this. So researchers at UCSF found that sleep-deprived individuals sleeping less than 6 hours per night in their study were 11 and a half times less likely to get protected by a vaccine than those who got adequate sleep.
Should be front page news.
Here's a donut.
Yeah.
How about we get some coaching on basic premises of human functionality, which is you need to sleep. Sleep is when your immune system is doing, scientifically speaking, a buttload of things to fortify your health. And 11 and a half times, that's a massive difference, So these are the things that are not being talked about. And by the way, I pulled this up because I want to show you. And we'll put this, maybe we won't put this up on the video just in case, but they just changed. And I don't know if you've been paying attention to changing the definitions of things, like in the dictionaries, like the online dictionaries and such. But in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, it was just changed. Anti-vaxxer, the definition was changed from a person who opposes vaccination to a person who opposes vaccination or laws that mandate vaccination.
Oh my gosh.
Because for me, I'm pro-science. I don't care what the interjection or the adjunct is. I don't care. So it's not inherently being anti-vaccine, but the mandates around these things, abandoning logic and ignoring things like natural immunity, like where's the science? And this is what I want to talk to you about, false dichotomy, and having these conversations with folks, because that's what science is. It's looking at the data and having rational, logical conclusions. Where we've got, as you mentioned, countries that are backing off on mandates around that and really honoring natural immunity because it exists. And as a matter of fact, it's very likely more robust. There are some studies showing, hey, maybe it's kind of similar, but the majority of high quality data that we have shows that it's more effective. And it just makes sense because it's providing a spectrum of protection versus just targeting the spike protein in an artificial kind of response. So let's talk about this false dichotomy, because I know a lot of folks are having a difficult time having these conversations with family members, with friends, and we're in a tough situation where, again, jobs are forcing folks to be vaccinated, even if they've had a COVID infection, which is not really even logical. So what's the point? What's the point of forcing this upon somebody? Is this about actual protection, or is it something else?
Yeah, I mean, this is really, it's an important question because it's breaking up families, relationships, spouses. People have different opinions about what they should do for their children. And I think the big, again, if we want to be science-based about this, the Journal of the American Medical Association, or maybe it was Archives of Maternal Medicine, one of the two, show that the people that are most likely to have side effects from the vaccine are the people who had also been previously infected. So you're like, well, you're having a much higher probability. And I'm not saying these vaccines are going to cause you to grow 3 arms, but we do know that side effects are a complication linked with immunizations, particularly these ones. So you're basically telling that person that you're denying that their immune system has any memory to this virus, and then you're increasing the odds at which they're going to have a side effect as well. And the side effects are not totally benign, right? Some people have died. Some people have had embolytic or clotting events. Some people have had neurologic stuff. And so that's kind of, again, if we're going to be science-based about this, and I think a lot of people have just been convinced, it's a similar false dichotomy with the face masking thing, where it's like, if you don't wear a face mask, you must want people to die. It's creating this weird network tribalism thing where people identify more with what they disagree with. So it's kind of this phenomenon, and there's been some videos circulating about this. And that's really, I think it's really disappointing. Honestly, I think it comes from the media being so dishonest, saying, and again, I will tell you, the data is pretty clear that these vaccines do reduce risk of dying, right? The data has shown that, and I know there's some conflicting data there, and I looked at the data in Israel and all of that, but they do not block transmission. That is obvious. The CDC's own study from every week, and I encourage any one of my video listeners and all that to check out the CDC's Morbidity Mortality Weekly Report, MMWR. They always put out interesting things like the obesity in kids and all that. And there was an outbreak over the 4th of July somewhere in the Hamptons. And that occurred in 73%. Like 73% of people that tested positive were fully vaccinated in that. And that literally that MMWR was what led to the renewed face mask mandates throughout the US, right?
Look at that.
You're like, people are like, they watch CNN and they hear about, oh, if you don't get vaccinated, you must want people to die. But the CDC's own study showed that it doesn't completely block transmission. In fact, if you look at the rates of hospitalization, there were 6 people from that outbreak, so to speak, in the Hamptons. 5 of the 6 were fully vaccinated that ended up in the hospital. So you're like, well, if you just took someone who woke up from a coma through all of COVID, and so they didn't have any emotional connection or skin in the game, and you shared with them this MMWR, they would be like, well, why are we mandating vaccines for people? And again, I'm not saying that people shouldn't get immunized, especially if they're higher risk or they're elderly, probably, but, clearly we're being told something that may not be totally true. It's sort of like the double masking when you're out walking or hiking. You're like, the odds of getting outdoor transmission is like 1 in 10,000 or something crazy. It's like infinitesimally small. So it's like this identity. It's like this religion. Like you're part of the tribe if you do this thing. So I don't know where we go from here. And so what I've been doing, because I'm personally, my wife is Canadian and all her family is Canadian, and they the only sort of network news they get up there is CNN. And so I know my in-laws are into everything that's going on from a mainstream medicine narrative standpoint. And so my mother-in-law will not let my wife go visit her, right? And we've already had COVID. We've tested our T cells. Tdetect.com is how you test it. We've tested antibodies. We all have that. But she's like, no, that's not sufficient for me. We can't have you do that. We need you to get immunized. And she's like, Mom, like I've already anyway. So it's creating this weird conversation. Like it's straining relationships. It's tough.
Yeah, that's so heartbreaking. So heartbreaking. My wife's best friend, her father isn't talking to her because she hasn't been immunized, and she is literally the healthiest person in the family by far, and it's not about being anti-vaccine. It's just like, what's the right choice in this scenario based on my immune system, my COVID exposure, all these other factors. And it's just like, get the vaccine or else, which how are we even in this place? It's just like, truly, we started off like, you know what, guys, let's be careful about this, social distance, wash your hands, to get this vaccination or you're going to lose your job, or get this vaccination or else, fill in the blank. And for our government to literally force companies in our society today to fire folks, to have to, face litigation themselves or fines if they don't abide by this new government mandate. And the thing is, and this is a very simple principle. This is new. It's not like this has been around for a few years. We have a lot of long-term safety data. As far as that's concerned, we literally have no idea, because in a sense, it is changing how our cells operate. And most instances, some long-term side effects, when most drugs hit the market, it's on average, and we'll put a study up for everybody who's watching the video. It's on average about 4 years later when the drug is finally acknowledged to be problematic and recalled, right? 4 years on average. That's on average. And so the false premise here is that people know exactly what's going to happen. And literally nobody on planet Earth knows what's going to happen. Nobody. We can hypothesize. We could say things look good so far. But if we're being honest about the data, things don't exactly look really good. There are a lot of very concerning things we've never seen before. Myocarditis in kids, like to such a degree that it's actually being acknowledged. And also, I just did a little piece that, as of this recording, I've put it out everywhere. And I went and actually analyzed the VAERS database, which is unnecessarily complex in and of itself. And I brought forth this thing that's been talked about, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of women with abnormalities with their menstrual cycle. And that was getting brushed under the rug, getting censored per usual. But some really great scientists, again, they're just like, I'm not anti-vaccine. I went and got vaccinated, but this thing happened. And I talked to some other female friends, scientists, and they like, that happened to me too. And so now, per this recording, the NIH has just launched, I don't know if you saw this, they just launched a big fund in providing almost $2 million in funding for research to investigate the abnormalities with menstrual cycles for women who've gotten the COVID vaccine, because it's a big deal. The question is, why did it take over a year for it to get acknowledged? Because this was happening very early on in the campaign. So, it's great that people are asking these questions, but it's because of mediums like this and people really speaking up and forcing the conversation, because the entities that are controlling these things, they would brush it under the rug per usual. So, we've got, and here's the question that I want to pose you.
Yeah.
And this, again, it's just a hypothesis. What could be happening where we inject something into our arm and it's affecting our heart, or it's affecting the menstrual cycle? Like, what is the underlying mechanism for that to even be a thing?
Well, I mean, it's interesting you bring that up, because there was that study that I sent to you in Bristol University. Some scientists asked this very question, which I think, and let me just pause before we dive into it. I think, honestly, this topic is so radioactive for even scientists to ask the question about, what if this spike protein is not as benign as we think it is? We've assumed that it's just this benign sort of extracellular antigen. It's just like hanging out on the SARS-CoV-2, and it doesn't cause any pathology or disease. It's totally benign. But what if it's not benign? And I honestly think that scientists will get their funding cut, they'll get censored, they'll get ostracized from the medical community or research if they even ask this question, because this question was asked by this group in the UK. And what they found is that this spike protein, so there's like 28 or 26 different S proteins or spike proteins on the extracellular part of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. That's what enables it to latch onto your cells, like in your airway epithelial, the endothelial cells in your lungs and in your heart and cardiovascular system. And that's what enables the virus to go in and take over your cellular machinery and replicate and so forth. Well, it turns out that there's hydrolytic, or there's enzymes that snip the spike protein off the virus. And that's found, the spike protein has been found in the urine. It's been found in the bladder, in the whole blood. It's just circulating. It's going around. So these scientists were like, okay, well, what does it do? And they looked at different human hearts. So they looked at cadaver hearts, and they took out different cells, and they found that it alters the function of this critical cell in your entire circulatory system and microvascular system known as this pericyte. And it's also found in the brain as well. And so this pericyte is sort of like, the best analogy that I created I'm not an expert in this field, but it's sort of like a janitor or a housekeeper within your cardiovascular system. Like, it's helping the endothelial cells, like if they get damaged, help to repair them and help to make connections. And so this pericyte gets totally dysfunction through this so-called CD147 mechanism. It's more complex, but it triggers this intracellular signaling cascade of an inflammation that is the spike protein does in this critically important cell known as the pericyte, which is a really, it's like mortar in the bricks of your cardiovascular system, essentially. And so you ask the question, well, how are 17-year-old kids getting myocarditis after this vaccination? Like, what is going on here? How are people getting strokes or blood clots in their brain, or what's going on with the menstrual? It seems that one of the mechanisms could be this inflammatory induction and changing the functional activity of this very important cell type. It's found in the heart, in your microvessels throughout in the capillaries and so forth, and also in the brain. And again, I thought that study would have been referenced like 100 times. Like, so many people would have been like, okay, we got to dive into this. Let's put a pause button, especially on low risk individuals. But no, it hasn't been referenced once. And what was interesting, and I know you've done this, you'll reach out to a scientist or an author on a paper. They're super excited because they're in their research lab. They're publishing this stuff. They get back to you usually right away. I sent 2 emails to this group and I didn't hear anything back. And I would just want to know more, like, hey, maybe could we chat? And I heard it was crickets. And that, again, I'm totally speculating here, but I honestly think, again, this topic is so radioactive because of the potential implications of, it turns out, because this is the platform or the delivery system for all of these currently available immunizations. And if it turns out that there is some iatrogenesis or unintended harms that weren't really fully thought through, that could be a bad situation. So I don't know. That doesn't mean that no one should ever get the vaccine. I'm just saying, like, okay, if this is true, why don't we recommend people exercise beforehand? Make sure that if they have increased blood thickness, or they have a family history of clotting or hypercoagulation type events, they're at higher risk for stroke. Like, maybe they should do some things beforehand, go on blood thinners, do something to maybe augment the potential side effects that are known here from a mechanistic standpoint. Things come to mind like going in the sauna, exercising, walking. I find this with a lot of my male clients that I've worked with over the years, thick blood. So hemoglobin hematocrit are common blood tests that you find on your complete blood count, CBC. And in most men, because they're not menstruating, their blood is really thick. And so if maybe a family member or friend that you know of is going to go get vaccinated, maybe they should donate blood ahead of time so that their blood might not be so thick and prone to coagulate if there is this off-target complication with clotting, potentially. So again, these are things that again, you have to step back and go, okay, well, is this too complicated of a public health message? Is that why it's not being discussed? Is it just ignorance? Is it just that the system is not as efficient as we think it is? Like you said, we should be encouraging exercise and sleep to make these things more effective if people are going to go down that road. We should be doing things that are practical to reduce the potential downsides afterwards. So people, I'm sure you've gotten this question, hey, my employer's making me get this. What do I do? How do I detox? And so those are some things that I would suggest is donating blood, making sure you go in the sauna, because sauna therapy improves microcirculation and improves the vasodilation. So that could be something very helpful. Obviously, get a good night's sleep and not eat foods that are going to induce coagulation. So fried foods, processed foods, have a low glycemic index diet. Treat this like you would treat any sort of event that you would do that's important to you. Like maybe you don't drink for a couple weeks beforehand, making sure you're walking, doing all these things leading up to it to make it more effective, number one, and also reduce potentially any downsides.
Hey, if you like this video, make sure to check out this video right here to up-level your health today.
There's something in our diet that has changed from traditional society to modern society that influences cancer rates. Sugar is one of the most